Can you believe that before 1900 there was no flying, no penicillin, no TV sets, homes? Yeah. And more. A lot of inventions we depend on and can't imagine life without weren't have existed before 1900. A lot of events happened during that interesting revolutionary century. Let's have an idea about the most famous historical events happened in the 20th century. Between 1900 to 1999. 1900s. This decade opened the century with some amazing feats like the first flight by the Wright brothers, Einstein's theory of relativity. The first mass-market camera, the Brownie, is introduced by Kodak. Sigmund Freud publishes one of his most significant works, The Interpretation of Dreams. 1 million people emigrate from Europe to the USA in just 1 year in 1901. And Frank Baum introduces children to Oz, in his book The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. 1910s. This decade was unfortunately dominated by the First Total War, World War I. It also saw other huge changes during the Russian Revolution and the beginning of Prohibition. The unsinkable Titanic hit an iceberg, and the Spanish flu killed millions around the world. On a more positive note, people in the 1910s got their first taste of an Oreo cookie. Gabrielle Coco Chanel opens a boutique of fashion design in 1912. Also, Albert Einstein expands his theory to gravitation as general relativity. 1920s. The Roaring Twenties were a time of short skirts, the Charleston dance, and jazz music. The 1920s also showed great strides in women's suffrage, and archaeology hit the mainstream with the discovery of King Tut's tomb. There were an amazing number of cultural firsts in the 1920s, including the first talking film. Arnold Schoenberg completes the first form of serialism. The British Broadcasting Company, BBC, begins broadcasting. And the first Mickey Mouse cartoon. Also, Mahatma Gandhi founds the non-violent liberation movement Satyagraha in India. European countries control almost 90% of the Earth's surface. Stalin orders the persecution of kulaks, causing the death of 6.5 million peasants. Mustafa Kemal Ataturk abolishes the Ottoman Empire, declares Turkey a republic. 1930s. The Great Depression hit the world hard in the 1930s. The Nazis took advantage of this situation and were able to come to power in Germany. Japan invades China. Australia and Canada become independent democracies. Iraq becomes an independent kingdom. South Africa is granted independence by Britain. A civil war that will kill 600,000 people erupts in Spain between the socialists and Francisco Franco's nationalists. Other news in the 1930s included the disappearance of Amelia Earhart, a wild and murderous crime spree by Bonnie and Clyde, and the imprisonment of Al Capone for income tax evasion. Also, Robert Watson Watt builds the first radar in Britain. Pan American inaugurates the world's first transatlantic passenger service, flying between New York and Marseille. The Empire State Building, the tallest building in the world of all times, opens in New York. The world's first major film festival is held in Venice in the 1940s. World War II was already underway by the time the 1940s began, and it was definitely the big event of the first half of the decade. When World War II ended, the Cold War began. The most tragic event in this decade, atomic bomb is dropped on Hiroshima, August 6, 1945. The 1940s also witnessed the assassination of Gandhi by a Hindu extremist and the beginning of apartheid. NATO is formed by Western European countries and USA. The first freeway is built in Los Angeles. First casino opens on what would become the Las Vegas Strip. The Cannes Film Festival debuts. 1950s. The 1950s are sometimes referred to as the Golden Age. Color TV was invented. The polio vaccine was discovered. Disneyland opened. And Elvis gyrated his hips on the Ed Sullivan Show. The Cold War continued as the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union began. The 1950s also saw segregation ruled illegal in the U.S. and the beginning of the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King organizes nonviolent protests against racial segregation. Italy, Germany, France and others found the European Economic Community. Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt nationalizes the Suez Canal. Ghana becomes the first black African country to win independence from a European power. The Dalai Lama of Tibet flees to India. NASA opens a research center near Mountain View. Mountain View. The first McDonald's opens near Chicago. Disneyland opens in Los Angeles. 1960s. To many, the 1960s can be summed up as the Vietnam War, hippies, drugs, protests, and rock and roll. Although those were important aspects of this decade, other events occurred as well. For instance, the Berlin Wall was built, the Soviets launched the first man into space, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated, the Beatles become popular, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. made his I Have a Dream speech, and so much more. While hippies were trying to counter violence, millions of Americans and Vietnamese died during the Vietnamese War. Mao launches the Cultural Revolution that will kill 1 million people and destroy thousands of monuments. Japan begins a spectacular economic growth with average annual GDP increase of 10.4%. Yasser Arafat becomes leader of the Palestine Liberation Organization. Nigeria becomes independent, and soon all the other British colonies in Africa become independent. All French colonies of Black Africa become independent. Also, Yves Saint Laurent opens a boutique of fashion design in Paris. General Motors unveils Unimate, the first industrial robot. The USA lifts into orbit the first telecommunication satellite, the Telstar. 1970s. There were tragic events this decade as well, including the deadliest earthquake of the century. The Jonestown Massacre, the Munich Olympics Massacre, the nuclear accident at 3 Mile Island. Spanish dictator Franco dies and Spain becomes a democracy. Angola becomes independent but civil war erupts between pro-Soviet and pro-USA groups. The Red Brigades terrorized Italy. Culturally, disco became extremely popular and Star Wars hit theaters. The first SIGGRAPH conference for computer graphics is held in Colorado. The first video cassette recorder, VCR, is introduced by Philips. 1980s. The end of the Cold War. This was soon followed by the surprising fall of the Berlin Wall. There were also some disasters this decade, including the oil spill of the Exxon Valdez. 900,000 people die in Ethiopia of famine. A hole in the ozone layer is discovered over Antarctica. Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan creates Al-Qaeda. And the discovery of AIDS. Culturally, the 1980s saw the introduction of the mesmerizing Rubik's Cube toy, Pac-Man video game, Michael Jackson's Thriller video. Ted Turner launches CNN, the first cable TV devoted to world news. The population of China is 1 billion. Canon demonstrates the first electronic camera. The ARPANET is officially renamed Internet. Microsoft ships the Windows operating system. Adobe releases Photoshop. Alec Jeffreys in Britain invents the DNA fingerprint that can identify an individual. Last but not least, 1990s. The increasing popularity of the Internet begins to open up worldwide communications. Later in 1995, the Internet is used by 16 million people. The Soviet Union is dissolved and its states become independent. Princess Diana dies in car crash. Civil war erupts in Somalia. The mad cow disease spreads in Britain. Nelson Mandela wins the first free elections in South Africa and becomes its first black president. The first DVD player is introduced by Toshiba. Amazon.com is launched on the web as the world's largest bookstore, except that it is not a bookstore, it is a website. Larry Page and Sergey Brin found Google to develop a search engine. Yahoo, Amazon, eBay and scores of internet-related startups create overnight millionaires. And the world prepares for the new millennium amidst fears of computers glitches due to the change of date. Y2K. Crazy world. Ha!